Long before the pyramids touched the sky, long before Babylon rose from the dust, there was a city that held the fate of gods and men alike. Its name was Nippur, the sacred heart of Sumer. Within its walls stood Ekur, the mountain house, where Enlil, lord of the wind and king of all gods, made his home. From this temple flowed the power that held the world in balance. As long as Nippur stood in harmony with the heavens, Sumer flourished. But when the pride of man rose higher than his reverence, the balance broke, and something sacred was lost. The ancient tablets speak of a curse, the Curse of Agade. They tell of a time when a mortal king defied the divine, when the sacred order between gods and men was broken, and the heavens turned away. Some say it was only a myth, a warning carved in clay. Others believe it was real, that something in Nippur was shattered, and its fall marked the beginning of the end for Sumer. To understand the curse we must return to the beginning, to Sumer, the land between the rivers, the cradle of civilization, where writing, law and time itself were born. It was here that humans first looked to the sky and saw the faces of gods. Cities like Uruk, Lagash and rose from the mud, crowned with temples that reached toward the heavens. At their center stood Nippur, the bridge between earth and sky, the city where destiny itself was decided. Kings of every land came to Nippur to seek Enlil's blessing. No crown could endure without it, for kingship was believed to descend from heaven through the temple of Ekur. Within its sanctum, Enlil bestowed favor, justice, and the divine right to rule. But divine gifts are fragile and easily forgotten. As centuries passed, the rulers of Sumer began to believe that the power was their own. Then came Akkad, a city born of Sumer, but driven by conquest. Under Sargon the Great, it united the lands and built the first empire in human history. His grandson, Naram-Sin, carried that power even further. He called himself king of the 4 quarters of the world. He wore the horned crown reserved for the gods. When the priests of Nippur denied him Enlil's favor, he answered not with prayer but with war. The legend says that Naram-Sin marched upon Nippur. His soldiers stormed the sacred city and broke into Ekur, shattering the home of the gods. In that moment, the wind fell silent, and Enlil turned his face away. From that silence came ruin. But was it truly the wrath of the gods, or something deeper, a warning hidden in history, waiting for those who dare to listen? Tonight we journey into that mystery, into the ruins of a city once blessed by the heavens, now buried beneath the sands of time, to ask a question that still echoes through the ages. Was it only a myth, or did the curse of Nippur truly bring Sumer to its end? If ancient mysteries spark your curiosity, do not forget to subscribe and share your thoughts about what you believe. Sometimes the answers we seek lie not in the stones of the past, but in the stories that refuse to die. At the end of the 19th century, a team from the University of Pennsylvania began one of the earliest systematic excavations in Mesopotamia. Between the years 1888 and 1900, they uncovered the ancient city of Nippur, long buried under layers of dust and clay. The site had been occupied for more than 3,000 years, and within its ruins the archaeologists discovered hundreds of cuneiform tablets written in Sumerian and Akkadian. Among these texts was a fragmentary composition that would later be identified as the Curse of Agade. The tablets were found in the temple area of Ekur and were later transferred to the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, where they remain today. Their contents told the story of Naram-Sin, his defiance of Enlil, and the destruction of Akkad. For the first time, a literary source known only through ancient references was recovered in physical form. The discovery linked a long Sumerian legend to a specific archaeological context, confirming that the account of Nippur's curse was not a later invention, but part of the cultural memory of early Mesopotamia. Long before history began to write its first lines, the people of Sumer believed that the universe was governed by invisible laws, sacred and unchanging, called Mi. These were the divine decrees that shaped all existence, the rhythm of the seasons, the order of kingship, the rules of art and wisdom. According to their belief, the gods had descended from the heavens to deliver these laws to humankind, entrusting them with the balance of creation. As long as that balance was kept, the world remained in harmony. Across the plains between the Tigris and the Euphrates, city-states rose like jewels upon the land. Each was devoted to a patron deity. Enki, the god of water and wisdom, guarded Eridu. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, watched over Uruk. Nana, the moon god, illuminated Ur. Yet above all these stood Enlil, lord of the wind, whose sanctuary lay in the holy city of Nippur. To the Sumerians, Enlil was not merely another god. He was the voice of order itself, the keeper of destinies, and the one who held in his hands the power to grant or withdraw kingship. Every new ruler, whether from Uruk, Lagash, or Kish, was required to travel to Nippur to offer sacrifices at the temple of Ekur, the mountain house of Enlil. There, beneath its towering ziggurat, priests performed the ancient rituals that affirmed a ruler's divine legitimacy. The ceremony was more than political. It was cosmic. Through it, the new king received Nam-Lugal, divine kingship, a sacred confirmation that his rule reflected the will of heaven. In return, the king pledged to uphold justice, honor the gods, and preserve harmony between humankind and the divine. For more than 1,000 years, this belief bound Sumer together. The cycle was perfect. The gods bestowed favor upon the king governed in righteousness. The people offered worship, and nature responded with abundance. Floods came when needed, crops ripened under the sun, and the temples flourished with song. The Mi kept the world in balance. But in the slow turning of centuries, even sacred orders begin to shift. Around 2334, before the Common Era, the steady rhythm of Sumer's fields and rivers was broken by the rise of a man whose origins were as mysterious as his destiny, Sargon of Akkad. His beginnings are still debated. Some later texts call him a cupbearer in the court of Kish, a servant who rose through loyalty and brilliance. Others tell a more legendary tale, of a baby set adrift on a river in a reed basket, found by a gardener, and raised to become a ruler chosen by fate. Whatever the truth, Sargon emerged from obscurity to shape the first empire humanity would ever know. From the northern plains, Sargon's armies began to move southward, disciplined ranks of soldiers carrying bronze weapons and banners that bore the star of Akkad. One by one, the ancient cities of Sumer, Uruk, Lagash, and Ur fell under his control. The campaigns were not random acts of conquest, but a carefully planned strategy to unite the fragmented city-states of Mesopotamia. Inscriptions later found at sites like Tel Umar and Kish describe how Sargon subdued 34 cities in a single campaign, then established governors loyal only to him. His rule was not chaos, it was system. Archaeological discoveries help us imagine the machinery of his empire. Akkadian tablets found at Mari and Ebla show records of shipments, rations, and correspondence written in the cuneiform script that his administration standardized. They reveal a web of communication and logistics: grain shipments from the south, copper from Magan, cedar from Lebanon, all converging at a new center of power. That center was Akkad, Sargon's capital, a city so influential that its name became synonymous with empire, yet its ruins have never been found. Scholars still search for it beneath the plains north of Babylon, near modern Baghdad. Ancient hymns describe Akkad as a shining metropolis, where silver and gold were as common as stones. Its markets overflowed with goods, its canals thronged with ships from distant lands. The walls of Akkad, said to be built of baked brick and decorated with bronze reliefs, reflected the wealth of the world. Under Sargon, trade and infrastructure flourished. He expanded irrigation systems, built roads that linked distant provinces, and established storehouses managed by scribes who recorded every delivery. The empire stretched from the Persian Gulf in the south to the Taurus Mountains in the north, and from Elam in the east to the Mediterranean in the west. Sargon called himself King of the Four Quarters of the World, a title meant to proclaim universal dominion. But Sargon's achievement was more than military. He created a model of government that would shape empires for millennia. He replaced the old priestly councils with royal administrators, introducing a new order where power flowed downward from the throne rather than from the temples. Temples still stood, their priests still chanted to the gods, but the axis of power had shifted. The throne now rivaled the altar. Even in his lifetime, Sargon's image became larger than life. Akkadian seals show him standing beside gods, receiving symbols of kingship from the divine. His scribes recorded victories, irrigation projects, and decrees in the newly dominant Akkadian language, the first shared language of the ancient world. In doing so, they laid the foundation for centuries of imperial administration across Mesopotamia. Yet behind the empire's grandeur, something quiet began to change. The spiritual heart of Sumer, the sacred city of Nippur, and the temple of Ekur, where Enlil, lord of the wind, granted kingship to men, began to lose its influence. The old order, where divine will legitimized human rule, was slowly being replaced by human authority asserting its own divinity. The priests of Nippur kept their rituals, but fewer kings came to kneel. The voice of Enlil was still invoked, but it now echoed faintly under the growing shadow of Akkad. Sargon ruled for more than 50 years. His name became legend, his reign a symbol of order and ambition, yet every empire sows the seeds of its successor. When Sargon died, his descendants inherited not only his power, but also the weight of his creation. Among them was a grandson, whose story would carry the empire to its peak and to its fall. That grandson was Naram-Sin. When Sargon died, his grandson Naram-Sin inherited an empire at its height. He was bold, ambitious, and determined to surpass the legacy of his grandfather. Records from his reign speak of massive construction projects, temples built across Mesopotamia, and trade routes stretching far beyond the horizon. Archaeological discoveries show the scale of his reach. Akkadian seals and inscriptions have been found from the mountains of Anatolia to the shores of the Persian Gulf. Naram-Sin maintained order with a network of governors and scribes who reported directly to him. Under his rule, the empire reached a level of organization that historians now call the first true imperial system. The most iconic symbol of his reign is the victory stele of Naram-Sin, found centuries later in Susa. Carved in pink limestone, it shows the king climbing a mountain, surrounded by soldiers gazing upward. Above him, rays of light fall from the heavens onto his horned crown. The horns were sacred, a mark of the gods. No mortal had ever dared to wear them. In that single image, the boundary between man and God began to blur. To his people, it was a vision of glory. To the priests of Nippur, it was dangerous. They believed that by placing himself beside the gods, Naram-Sin had disturbed the cosmic order. In temple hymns written after his reign, scribes warned of a ruler who set his heart above the heavens. For a time, the empire continued to prosper. Canals flowed, trade thrived, and Akkad shone like the heart of the world. But beneath the surface, tension grew. Governors became restless, omens turned dark, and whispers from Nippur spoke of divine silence. Enlil, they said, had turned his face away. Around the year 2200, before the Common Era, those warnings seemed to take form. Across northern Mesopotamia, the rains failed. The great rivers fell to half their flow. Winds from the deserts to the west carried dust that choked the fields. Archaeologists at Tel Leilan and Tel Brak have uncovered evidence of a severe drought lasting nearly 3 centuries. A climatic collapse described in modern studies such as Weiss and others. Published in the journal Science in 1993, sediments reveal layers of wind-blown dust and traces of abandoned irrigation canals. In the south, the Euphrates changed its course, leaving once fertile lands barren. The network of canals that had sustained the cities began to crumble. To the Sumerians, this was not chance. They believed Enlil had withdrawn his blessing. The floods that once came as gifts were withheld, and the air that once carried his breath turned still. The people murmured that the god of the wind had closed his hand over the land. Instead of seeking forgiveness, Naram-Sin chose defiance. He ordered vast projects to rebuild canals, to redirect the waters, to command nature itself to obey. In the royal inscriptions that survive, his tone grew restless, impatient with the god's silence. Later generations would remember this moment as the seed of the curse, the instant when humanity tried to rule not just the earth but the heavens. The me, the sacred balance that had governed Sumer for more than 1,000 years, was breaking. The law of gods and men, once aligned, had diverged. And in that widening distance, the first whispers of the Curse of Nippur began to form, not yet spoken, but already felt in the windless air above the dying fields. In the later years of Naram-Sin's reign, the empire that had once stretched from sea to mountains began to show signs of strain. The records that once chronicled endless victories grew fewer, and tablets from distant cities stopped arriving at the capital. The flow of trade slowed, the great storehouses emptied, and messengers brought troubling news from the north. What had begun as whispers of bad harvests turned into something far more severe. The rains had stopped. Across Mesopotamia, the skies stayed dry for years. The rivers sank lower with every season, their banks cracking in the sun. Canals that had fed the fields turned to lines of dust. Archaeological layers from Tel Leilan, Tel Brak and Nippur reveal the same story. Layers of fine, wind-blown sediment replaced the dark, fertile soil of earlier centuries. Abandoned homes and collapsed irrigation channels show that people fled in large numbers, leaving once thriving cities behind. To the Sumerians, these events were not natural accidents. They saw them as signs that Enlil, the god of wind and lord of destinies, had withdrawn his favour. In hymns and laments written later, scribes described how the breath of Enlil no longer filled the air. The wind that once carried the promise of rain now brought only dust. The earth cracked open, and even the temples fell silent. To them, this was the beginning of the curse. Naram-Sin refused to accept silence as destiny. Determined to restore what had been lost, he launched massive public works projects. Workers dug deeper canals, rebuilt dams, and cleared riverbeds in an effort to bring back the water. Inscriptions from his reign speak of these efforts, though their tone changes from confidence to frustration. The king issued decrees demanding loyalty and tribute to fund reconstruction, but the drought deepened, and the gods remained silent. Each passing year tightened the grip of hunger and despair. According to the Curse of Agade, Naram-Sin sought Enlil's favour for 7 years without reply. He sent offerings to Nippur, the holy city where the god's temple, Ekur, stood as the link between heaven and earth. Yet no omen came, no voice answered. In Sumerian belief, such silence was not simply absence, it was judgment. The priests warned that kingship itself had been withdrawn from the land. Without Enlil's blessing, the foundation of the world was trembling. As crops failed and rebellion spread in the provinces, Naram-Sin made a fateful decision. If Enlil would not answer, then the king would confront him directly. He gathered his army and marched on Nippur. The journey would have been long and desperate, the rivers half dry, the wind carrying only dust. By the time his forces reached the sacred city, they were said to have numbered in the tens of thousands. The priests of Nippur refused to open the temple gates. What happened next was written centuries later as both history and warning. The text tells that Naram-Sin entered the holy precinct of Ekur and destroyed it. He stripped the gold from its altars, scattered its offerings, and left its courtyards in ruins. For the Sumerians, this act was unthinkable. To attack the house of Enlil was to shatter the bridge between gods and men. Whether the destruction truly happened or not, the story marked a turning point. Excavations at Nippur reveal no single layer of destruction that matches the tale, only traces of rebuilding and decay. Yet the legend endures because it captured what people felt, that something sacred had been broken. After the attack, the poem says, Enlil summoned the gods to pass judgment on Akkad. The decree was swift and merciless. The land would be stripped of abundance, the rivers would dry, and the people would eat dust instead of bread. The tablets describing this curse are filled with imagery of desolation. The fields produced no grain, the wells yielded no water, and the flocks wandered the plains without shepherds. Modern evidence supports the scale of this catastrophe. Around 2,000, 200 to 2,000, 150. Before the Common Era, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers both shifted their courses. Salt built up in the fields, making the soil barren. Cities that had stood for centuries were abandoned. Layers of sand and silt buried canals, and even major administrative centres like Akkad and Sippar vanished from records. The empire that had once united the known world collapsed within a few decades. By 2154, before the Common Era, groups from the Zagros Mountains, later called the Gutians, moved into the weakened plains. They occupied cities one by one, cutting off what remained of the old Akkadian administration. Sumerian chronicles describe them as wild and uncontrollable, a people who knew no gods, who ate no bread. Archaeology confirms the period of chaos that followed. Seals were broken, archives abandoned, and trade networks dissolved. Akkad disappeared into history. The Sumerians who survived recorded the fall not as simple conquest but as divine retribution. In their eyes it was the result of a broken covenant. The silence of Enlil, the defiance of Naram-Sin, and the ruin that followed became one unbroken chain of cause and consequence. Whether literal or symbolic, this story became the lasting explanation for the fall of the first great empire in human history. When the dust of Akkad had settled, the once mighty empire was gone. Its cities lay quiet, its canals filled with silt, and its language faded from royal inscriptions. The power that had ruled from the mountains to the sea vanished almost without trace. Yet out of the ruins, new centres of life began to rise. The survivors of Akkad's collapse returned to the southern plains, rebuilding upon the bones of their ancestors. There, in the city of a new dynasty emerged that would become the last great flowering of Sumerian civilization. King Ur-Nammu, founder of the third dynasty of began his rule around 2112 before the Common Era. He inherited a land scarred by drought and invasion, but he approached it not as a conqueror, rather as a restorer. His inscriptions speak of bringing order back to the land, restoring the abandoned temples, and returning the gods to their seats. Archaeologists have found bricks stamped with his name across Mesopotamia, marking the scope of his rebuilding projects. Cities that had once been silent began to hum again with trade, labour, and prayer. Among his greatest works was the restoration of the temple of Enlil at Nippur. For 1,000 years, Ekur had been the heart of divine authority, the place where kings received their legitimacy from heaven. Its destruction in legend had symbolized the breaking of the sacred order. By rebuilding it, Ur-Nammu sought to heal that wound. He ordered the ziggurat of Nippur rebuilt with baked bricks bound in bitumen following the ancient plans recorded on tablets. Priests rededicated the sanctuary, chants were renewed, and the ceremonies of divine kingship resumed. To the people of Sumer, it must have seemed that balance had returned. Under Ur-Nammu and his son Shulgi, the land prospered once more. Canals were cleared, granaries filled, and merchants returned to the trade routes that stretched to Elam and the Levant. The scribes of developed a new system of administration, recording taxes, laws, and labour on thousands of clay tablets. Ur-Nammu's legal code, one of the earliest in history, set penalties and rights that reveal a society striving for stability after centuries of chaos. Temples flourished again, music and poetry filled the courts, and the ziggurats of and Nippur gleamed in the sun. For nearly a century it seemed as though the Sumerians had restored what had been lost. But time and the world beyond Sumer were changing. To the east, the kingdom of Elam gathered strength. To the north and west, Amorite tribes began to move down from the steppes, seeking new lands along the rivers. The walls of grew taller, but the threats multiplied. After the reigns of Ur-Nammu and Shulgi, the dynasty weakened. Corruption spread through its bureaucracy, the economy strained under the weight of tribute, and regional governors began to act with growing independence. The harmony that had briefly returned started once again to fracture. By 2004, before the Common Era, the storm finally broke. Elamite forces invaded from the east, capturing cities along the border and advancing toward The chronicles tell that Sin, the last king of tried to rally his people, but the defences collapsed. The city was taken, its treasures carried away, and its temples burned. With the fall of the last great Sumerian dynasty came to an end. The political order that had begun with the first city-states more than a millennium earlier was gone. In its place rose new powers speaking new tongues, the Amorites, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians, who inherited the legacy of Sumer but not its name. The rebuilding of Ekur could not turn back the course of history. Nature and empire alike had moved beyond the reach of ritual. Yet what endured was memory. The Sumerians had taught the world how to write, how to build, and how to remember. They pressed their stories into clay, leaving behind the voices of their kings, their priests, and their poets. Among those stories was the tale of Naram-Sin and the curse that followed him, a legend that outlived the empire itself. Centuries later, scribes in Babylon and Assyria still copied the Curse of Agade, retelling how pride had led to ruin and how divine order, once broken, demanded restoration. They saw in it not only the fall of a city but the rhythm of all history. The silence of Akkad, the rebuilding of and the endless return of rise and decline became a pattern repeated in every age. And so the story of Nippur, Akkad, and survived, not as prophecy, but as memory. Beneath the sands of Iraq, archaeologists have uncovered the bricks and tablets that carry their words, voices from a world 4,000 years gone. In the end, what the Sumerians left behind was not just their temples or their kings, but the memory of how a civilization can fall, rise again, and fade into the dust, leaving only stories pressed into clay to speak for them. In 1956, the Sumerologist Samuel Noah Kramer wrote that even their fall was a lesson. The Sumerians taught us how to remember. His words captured the pattern seen across all ancient civilizations. From Sumer to Babylon, from Greece to Rome, the same rhythm repeated: rise, excess, and decline. When Akkad fell, the wind did not stop. It carried the dust of a vanished empire across the plains, whispering over broken walls and dry canals. Seasons turned, then centuries. But what happened to Nippur did not stay buried. The same pattern of abundance, imbalance, and silence unfolded again and again across the world. Far to the west, along the Nile, Egypt trusted the rhythm of its river. Yet there came a time when the floods no longer came. Crops withered, and famine spread beneath the shadow of the pyramids. To the east, the cities of the Indus Valley, once perfectly laid with streets and wells, grew empty when the monsoon weakened. In China, the Yellow River rose and swallowed its towns. Across oceans and ages, the story repeated. When the earth shifted, the civilizations that depended on it began to fade. The Sumerians called it the will of the gods. We now call it climate. But both spoke of a truth older than language, that the world moves on its own terms, regardless of human ambition. 4,000 years later, the same soil that buried Nippur still breathes beneath the same sun. The canals once carved by Sargon's engineers stretch dry across the desert. The Euphrates runs thinner each year, winding past villages where farmers still look to the horizon for rain that no longer comes. From above, satellites trace the same patterns: rivers retreating, fields turning pale, clouds of dust drifting over towns. The earth has not changed its rhythm. Only we have forgotten how to listen. In the time of Sargon and Naram-Sin, collapse came quietly. The rains failed, harvests shrank, and people moved away, carrying fragments of their old lives to new lands. They did not know they were living through the end of an age. No one ever does. Today the signs are clearer. Glaciers melt, seas rise, forests burn, and storms reshape the map. The same story unfolds once more, no longer carved in clay but recorded in data. Yet history has never been only about loss. After Akkad came and after came Babylon, each rebuilt from the dust of the last, carrying knowledge instead of fear. They learned to reshape the river, to adapt, to begin again. The ruins of Nippur remind us that endings are never final, they are pauses before another beginning. As night falls over the desert, the wind moves through what remains of Nippur. It hums through hollow bricks and across shards of clay that once held words about gods and kings. Perhaps it is the same sound Naram-Sin once heard when the fields fell silent, the voice of the earth, patient and unchanged. If you listen carefully, it does not speak of curses or warnings. It speaks of memory, of cycles, of a world that endures even when those who shape it forget how to follow its rhythm. So tonight, as you drift to sleep, imagine the wind over those ancient sands, whispering in a tongue older than memory. Let it remind you that everything we build carries a story, and every story carries a lesson. What do you think truly ended Sumer? Was it the curse of the gods, or the curse of man himself? If you found this story meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to support our work. Leave a comment and share your thoughts with us. See you soon, and good night.